So for the next, well, for the foreseeable future, the intros to my videos are going to be a little different. I do like to do the intros with the project I'm working on in front of me, but fortunately for myself, I'm about 3 weeks or so ahead of what's being posted on YouTube. For the most part, the years I've been making my channel, it's very close to real time. But now I'm ahead, which is nice. It gives me a nice buffer for producing the videos. But that also means by the time I remember to film the intro for the video I'm editing, the project is no longer in my shop. So I'm still going to make the intros. I just don't have the piece that I'm talking about in front of me. But this was what I consider to be a pretty special project. Before the holidays, I was approached by someone via email who watches the channel about giving me a really nice, it's actually right here, older style Wilton vise. It's super solid. It's a really nice vise. I've actually used these before. He told me it came out of an old school. The retail value on these is quite high compared to the one I've been using, which I complain about on the YouTube channel, is a vise I got off of Amazon that's just not great. The nicest part of this is this vise only opened to less than 3 inches wide. This one goes to almost 7, so it's just an automatic game changer for the shop. And he, like I said, offered to give it to me, but I just don't like taking things for free. So after we went back and forth a little bit, he came up with the idea of bartering. So he would give me the vise and I was going to make a surprise for his young granddaughter. And I love working this way. Barter is one of my most favorite ways to work. I wish I could do it all the time, honestly, but I do have bills to pay. So he left the design, everything style up to me. So my main goal with making this was I wanted to make something, I believe he told me that she is 2.5, and I did not want to make something that she would outgrow. So that is how I kind of came up with the idea for the toboggan. It's big enough that I could fit on it if I wanted to ride it. So it could last her quite a while. And I had always wanted to make one. I just think they're kind of cool. They look beautiful when they're done. They're aesthetic pieces. And I love steam bending, and I don't really have an excuse to do it a lot. So that's kind of how I came up with the idea for it. I also knew from our email correspondences that he geographically lived in a spot where they do get snow. It would have been around here. We sometimes get snow, so we sometimes don't. It's actually freezing. It's 29 degrees in my shop right now. So that is what this video is going to entail. It's going to be a 2-part series, and the first part is mostly going to be the actual bending of the lumber. And I'm not going to get too in depth on how I did that. You'll see it in the video, but if I have a much longer comprehensive video, it's about 25 minutes long, showing how I made my steam box and the basics of bending wood. It would have been too much to put it into this video as well. So if you want to get more in-depth information on that, you can check that out. So the first thing I did was I found an arc I wanted to work off of, which ended up being a stool in my shop, and I kind of did a test bend with the same lumber I'd be using for the piece in order to make sure I could get that severe of an arc. And I was able to. There was a couple little checks in it just because I didn't prepare the lumber enough, but this circle would work. So then I traced that circle onto some scrap plywood, and I could start making the bending jig for this. You'll see in the video I end up making a different bending jig just because the logistics of this didn't work out how I wanted it to. I was originally going to make a bending and drying jig. I just didn't have enough clamps to do that. So I end up using both pieces. You'll see that in the video. But the original intention was to make this a 1-part jig. So I'm just using a piece of Luan that I have a center hole punched in. And I'm making a circle out of that plywood. This is a very simple jig. I just mount my router to it. That's a down cut spiral bit, and over a couple passes I could cut that circle. Then I put it on the edge of my table saw, so I had it across 2 axes, and I could kind of map out where I wanted the bottom of the toboggan to be, as well as I wanted the curve to end. So you could see I marked it as start and stop. and then I just mounted it through the center that I used for the circle cutting jig, put a piece of plywood on my miter gauge, and with a dado stack, a 3/4 inch dado stack, I could cut all the grooves I want in this pretty easily and safely. So you can see that's a 3/4 inch stack, and I could just cut grooves in it because this will have strips of plywood going across it. It'll be an open jig so the air can completely surround the piece, but also strong enough that the curve will conform to the jig. So there was no rhyme or reason to how many slots I put in there. I usually err on the side of more is better on stuff like this. And you can see I screwed both of them together so that they're exactly identical. These were about a little over an inch deep. I think most of them were 1.25 inches. So then I could rip 1.25 inch strips out of 3/4 inch plywood and start building this jig. So then just some glue in place, and I could hold it together with some brads. So like I said, pretty simple process to build this. With steam bending and jigs, it's kind of a process of trial and error. I make some modifications to this. It's good to start with a solid plan, but you'll see as you go that you might have to make some changes, and I'll show you those changes as they go. So I wanted a piece at the bottom that will hold the beginning of the bend, so you can see where the bottom is and where the bend's going to start on this. I'm adding just a shim piece of lumber that I could then build some stock up onto. It's just a scrap piece of a scrap piece of, I believe, a 2x4 I made to put it in there. So you can see I was actually working at this at the same time I was working on the walnut modular built-in that's in the background. Then on top of that piece, I'm adding a 3/8 inch piece of lumber. The lumber I'm making this out of is going to be ripped to a 1/4 inch, but when it's steamed, it's going to gain some moisture and it's going to swell. So I'm using a 3/8 inch piece to make sure that it will fit in where I'm putting the cleat. So this is basically just a spacer, and then I put another piece on top of that. This is just a scrap piece of plywood. I made it longer because at this point I thought I was going to attach this to the table in order to bend. But you could see now the beginning of the arc, I could slide it underneath that piece of plywood. You could see how there's a little gap there, and then that will hold it in place as I'm bending the pieces. So the ideal of this was to not only have a drying rack, but also that it could roll on the table, and that would avoid having to put some sort of exterior frame on, as you would in if you watch the steam bending video that I have. A bending strap has an exterior frame to keep that lumber from splintering on the outside. The concept of this was if I was rolling it on the table would act as that exterior frame, and I wouldn't need a bending strap. So then I just added this very, very rudimentary jig frame exoskeleton almost on the back side, and that is where the excess lumber would go. So you could see this view isn't the best, but this is still a practice piece. This isn't the real lumber, and I could just kind of roll it on the table and get it in there. Now this piece broke, and the only reason it broke, you'll see, is there was an insect hole right through the center that I did not notice, and that's where it broke. So that was enough for me to realize that the jig would work without having the insect holes in there. So you can see I have my steam box over there. The steam, I get to about 212 degrees in the shop. This is 1/4 inch lumber, so I only steam it for about 20 minutes. And then you could see it rolls right in place. So this was the original concept for this jig, that I could roll them and clamp them all at once. You could see it clamped in place. Like I said, this is still a practice piece, so it's a little bit shorter than what I ended up with, and that is what the curve will look like. So then I decided to make an actual singular bending jig. I could bend it on the jig, let it sit there for about an hour as it cooled, and then transfer it to the drying jig, mainly because I just didn't have enough clamps to use with the rolling one. So I just once again made the exact same circle, same process. I didn't film it because it's the same process, and then I'm just putting some 1.25 inch, using a Forstner bit to drill some 1.25 inch holes, so that I have a place to put clamps. Now this will stay in one piece. This is as thick as the lumber is, and I believe I started with 2-inch strips. So this is the oak I'm using. I'm jointing one edge. This oak is actually left over from my last steam bending project, which was actually about this time last year. I started this project before the holidays. I didn't finish it up till after the holidays, but so this lumber is about a year old. Now in the steam bending video, I mentioned what type of lumber you should be using, which is usually green lumber, as close to green as possible, not kiln dried. And this is not that lumber. This at this point is pretty dry because I've had it for a year. So I was a little nervous about using it, but it ended up working. It also has a bunch of knots in it, which I also in that video recommend do not using. I only had one failure in this bend because of the knots. They ended up working out because I kept the knots away as much as I could away from the parts that were being bent. So you can see I'm just ripping this now into 1/4 inch by 2-inch strips, but like I said, it's best to start with lumber that works best. This was a little bit of a challenge, but I was happy that it was able to work with what I had. So you can see I put a cleat on the bottom side of this one, just like the drying jig. I can roll it. The tabletop works as that bending strap, and then I could just clamp everything in place. Before I put this stuff in the steam box, I do take a little tiny plane and round over the edges. That helps with the edges splintering. So even though, like I keep saying, this lumber did work, this project would have been much easier if I had used quarter sawn clear grained greenish lumber. I would not recommend a first timer using lumber that's more dry and has some knots in it. You can see after an hour I could then take it off of the bending form and put it on the drying jig. Like I said, I usually keep it on that form for about an hour, so I could do a couple of these a day because they takes about an hour for my steam box to get to temperature. Each one's in there for about 20 minutes, but then it has to stay on the bending form for about an hour. You can speed that process up if you blow some dry air over it, but I just kept it on there for an hour. I could transfer it and then bend another one. So I could usually get about 3 or 4 done in a day, which is nice because you could work on other stuff while you're doing this. This is just another piece being bent, and then you could see transferring it. Now towards the end I was running out of clamps and space, so what I decided to do was add these almost wing extensions with conduit going through it. The conduit has is aluminum, so it won't stain the oak. If you use anything with iron in it, it will stain the oak. And you could see I could remove the conduit pieces, put the drying forms on there, and then reattach them, and this keeps everything in shape because I wanted this to dry for at least a week. This stuff is pretty thin. It doesn't have to dry for a super long time, but I wanted all the pieces to have a thorough amount of time to dry before I took them off. If I was ever to do this again, this is just showing, this is the one failure I had. I was really pushing the limits of the knots. This is just showing the spot where that part failed. So instead of bending it on that, I decided to bend it on this knot, and that piece worked. So I had one failure for this whole bend using that one piece of wood. But like I was saying, if I was to do this again, I would make it so that the conduit had a couple more connectors, because you'll see when you go to move the conduit to add a new piece, all of the pieces want to come out of the form. So if you had those wings interspaced between each one of your bended pieces, you would only have to move the conduit away enough to add a new piece. So that would be the one change I would make on this jig. Other than that, like I said, I only had one failure. This stuff all bent really nicely. You could see it's nice and tight to the form. They're all about the same size. Before I took these off the form, I did not film it, but I added epoxy to all the knots. So then I just have some pictures. This is the old vise. The problem with this vise is it just didn't open wide, and it was pretty rickety. It wasn't super solid. This one's nice. It has open mounted holes, so I can mount the lag bolts I'm using in there, slide it into place, and tighten everything. And the plus side of this one is the jaws are just so much bigger. It's very well built. Older things like this are just so much better built than newer products. It passes the grab it and shake it test after it's mounted, But the thing I'm looking forward to the most, especially because I do a lot of carving and stuff like that, is the jaws just open so much wider than my other piece. Like, carving the Mandalorian head would have been so much easier with this mounted in place. So it was just an all-around great interaction, and super happy that he emailed me that first time.